Aloha everyone, welcome to today's lecture where we will be talking about Chapter 2 in your e-text, which is all about the chemistry of life. So some of you may be concerned because maybe you're not a big fan of chemistry. I promise we're going to keep it pretty simple in terms of the chemistry that we talk about today. But really, in order to understand biology, or at least basic biology, we do need to have a little bit of an understanding of chemistry. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. Of course, we're going to start by looking at our learning objectives for today. So in other words, what should you be taking away from today's lecture? First of all, by the end of this lecture, you should know the 5 functional traits of all living organisms. In other words, if someone was to ask you, hey, is this living or is this non-living? This first learning objective should help you kind of understand whether it is living or not living. Secondly, know that all matter is made of elements. So we're going to look at what exactly matter is and how it is composed of different things. Then we're going to look at the 4 different molecules of life. And finally, we're going to explain the properties of water and also understand what exactly pH is. So let's go ahead and get started. In Chapter 2 in your e-text, you'll notice that they always have kind of a background story. So for Chapter 2, the background story is all about Mars and how we think that Mars may be the one planet that maybe someday we could potentially live on, or maybe some time in the past there might have been organisms living on Mars, there might have been life there, there might be life there now. So that's kind of the background story for your e-text. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Mars in this lecture just because I really want to focus on the chemistry side of things, but that's kind of the if you read through that e-text, and hopefully you are reading through it, you'll notice that each kind of section talks a little bit about Mars as it introduces you to chemistry. So Curiosity right here is this remotely controlled rover that NASA brought to Mars to explore the surface of the planet, including searching for life. So it may seem like, it's gotta be easy to distinguish between living and non-living things, but sometimes it's not as straightforward, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about at the start of this lecture. So one area of exploration that scientists are researching is whether life of some kind exists on Mars. So this is one of the rovers there. We also have done missions since then to kind of try to figure out more about Mars and understand more about, is there life there? Could there be life? If you Google Mars and life, you'll see a lot of different articles, including in your e-text. It kind of shows you what looks like water once was on Mars. We're not sure if there still is water there, but these rovers kind of drill different cores on the surface of Mars and just trying to kind of learn more about the planet. So that's kind of the background story. As you read the e-text, keep that in mind, that it's trying to always give you something kind of really interesting or something that you can kind of relate to life to introduce these different topics to you. And I always try to at least mention it in the lecture, but I don't spend too much time talking about it because you should be getting that through your e-text. But definitely a very interesting thing. I know some of my students in the past have said, if there was a mission to Mars where they sent people there to try to live and they could never return, some of my students are like, oh, we'd totally do that. And some other ones are like, no, there's no way I'd leave my family. But definitely something very interesting. And if it's something that you find interesting, definitely go ahead and Google that, and you can find some really cool scientific articles on Mars. Our first learning objective for today's lecture is to figure out what exactly is life. What is it that a substance or organism must have for us to say, yes, that is a living organism? So all living organisms have these 5 things in common. And we're going to go through these 5 different things in this flow chart. And if you are trying to decide if an organism is living, you have to go through these 5 things. And if you can check mark that box next to each one of them, then it is probably a living being. First of all living organisms must be able to grow. So growth is an increase in the cell size before reproduction when we're talking about unicellular organisms, which we'll talk more about in chapter 3. For multicellular organisms, which is what we are, what animals are, growth refers to an increase in the organism size as the number of cells making up that organism increases. So in other words, you started out as a baby, right? And now you are a young adult or maybe an adult. So that is what growth is, right? Obviously, we as humans check that box for growth. The next thing that a living organism must be able to do is to reproduce. So the process of producing new organisms, right? The offspring that are produced are going to be similar to their parents, but not identical. If you have any siblings, maybe you're a parent, you know this, right? Each one of your siblings is probably a little bit different from you, right? Unless they're identical twins. But even then, you can see some differences, right? Two of my nieces are identical twins. They have very different personalities, even though their DNA is identical, right? So the third thing then is homeostasis. And this may or may not be a term you've heard of before, so it's one of our vocab terms. Homeostasis is this process of maintaining a relatively constant internal state. So you're trying to keep your internal environment, so think of like inside of your body, you're trying to keep that constant, even though the exterior environment is going to be different. So maybe you're inside your nice air-conditioned car, or maybe you have the windows down and it's at least cool in your car, and then you step outside and it's hot. Your body has to maintain a constant internal temperature regardless of which of those environments you're in. So maintaining homeostasis is something living organisms must be able to do. The fourth thing that living organisms must be able to do is to sense and respond to stimuli. Stimuli, another vocab term, these are events that evoke or bring about a response. So organisms respond to stimuli in many different ways. You can say an organism smells food, they're going to move towards that food source. Or maybe they sense a predator, they're going to move away from a predator. So that can be something as simple as maybe you have a dog or a cat and you grab a treat. That smell of that treat, the organism, the dog or cat's going to sense that smell and they're going to want that treat, right? So that's a really simple example of responding to stimuli. The fifth and final thing that we talk about in regards to living organisms must do is they have to be able to obtain and use energy. So all living organisms are going to require an input of energy, so they must take in energy in order to function. So if we're talking about producers, that bottom trophic level that we talked about in our last unit of material, those producers are going to be getting their energy from the sun. Sunlight is going to be their energy that they take in order to do the process of photosynthesis, which we'll talk about later in this unit. So energy is going to come from sunlight if you're a producer, or it comes from food if you are a consumer. So all living things are going to break down either that sunlight or that food through a series of chemical reactions, and the sum of that is their metabolism. And metabolism is a term I know you've heard of, right? Maybe you're really mad at your metabolism because maybe you have a slow metabolism. Maybe you're pretty happy with your metabolism because you have a fast metabolism. And our metabolism can change a little bit. Some of it's controlled by genetics, so of course. But metabolism is something that all living things have, right? Because all living things must be able to obtain and to use energy. So these 5 things are what we kind of consider the 5 characteristics that all living organisms must have. If you were to Google something like this, you might see a list of 5, you might see a list of 6, you might see a list of 8. But these are kind of the basic 5 that you have to see for an organism to be living. So that last slide probably made it sound really simple, right? Well, it's a little more complicated than that, right? And I just put a few different examples here to kind of give you some examples of how sometimes it's not as cut and dry in regards to what life is. So first of all, take a mule. A mule is the offspring of a female horse and a male donkey. It's very obviously alive, right? But it can't reproduce. It is sterile. So this one doesn't check one of those 5 boxes, but obviously a mule is living, right? So there's always exceptions to the rule. Another example would be fire, right? Fire grows. It can reproduce, right? It grows in size. It uses energy, but fire is not technically alive. And then, of course, we have viruses. And I feel like viruses are very big in the news ever since COVID's onset in the beginning of, well, at least in the United States, beginning of 2020. But viruses, most biologists would tell you, are actually not alive. So viruses are not made of cells. They don't grow. They don't make their own energy. They can only reproduce by infecting a living cell, a process called viral replication. So entities such as viruses, you may have heard of prions before, they can replicate and they're composed of organic molecules. However, they can only reproduce with the help of other living things, and they do not really process energy. So I'm with kind of the majority of scientists, or a large group of scientists, that would tell you that viruses are actually not a living thing. There are some scientists that would argue otherwise, and that is fine. There's 2 sides to everything, right? But for the purpose of this class, I would say viruses are not a living organism. Next, we're going to move on to our second learning objective, which is to learn that matter is composed of basic structural units. So when we look at matter organization, matter is just simply anything that takes up space and has a mass. So if you look around the room that you're in, you see a lot of matter, right? Not necessarily living, right? Unless your cat or dog is in the room with you or other people are there. But matter is just anything that takes up space and has a mass. We have all matter being composed of basic structural units. Matter is made of elements, and elements are substances that cannot be chemically broken down. But we have an even smaller unit than our elements. So we have our atoms. Atoms are the smallest unit of matter that cannot be broken down chemically. Then you take a bunch of atoms, and atoms form elements. An element, like I said, is a type of substance that is made up of only one type of atom, and it has distinct chemical properties. So you've probably seen a picture before of the periodic table of elements, right? Maybe you had a really tough high school chemistry teacher that made you memorize that periodic table of elements. But those all are elements. So hydrogen, helium, carbon, oxygen. I could go on and on, right? Those are all elements. They are substances that cannot be chemically broken down. They just are only made of one type of atom. Then we move on to what we term molecules. This is when 2 or more atoms are going to join together. So 2 or more atoms of a particular element join together chemically. Then we have molecules. So water would be a molecule, right? Because you have, or I guess a better example would be like the oxygen that we breathe. Oxygen, O2 is how we write that chemically, right? So we're breathing that in. That's 2 oxygen atoms that are combined together to form a molecule. You also have your water, so H2O. So oxygen, hydrogen, coming together to form water. Up here, you have O and H. So you take 1 oxygen, 2 of these hydrogens to form your water. So we're going to talk a little more about matter organization as well in the following slides. But this is kind of your basic breakdown, starting with your atoms, then you go to your elements, then you go to your molecules. I wanted to talk a little more about atoms. So atoms, again, are the smallest unit of an element. that still retains the property of that element. And an atom has multiple subatomic particles. So in other words, you have your atom, and it is composed of multiple different subatomic particles that are going to determine the properties of that atom. So the nucleus of the atom is going to be that dense core. So right here, this is the nucleus of your atom. It's a dense core, and it contains two different subatomic particles. It is composed of your protons. Protons also give you your atomic number, so that's why it tells you atomic number right here. But protons are going to be positively charged. So they're shown here in the green. You can see the little plus sign on them. They have a positive charge. Think proton, P, right? Positive starts with a P to kind of help you remember that. They are positive, they're in the nucleus, and the atomic number of your element, that's going to be the same as the number of protons. That's termed your atomic number. And each element is actually placed in that periodic table by its atomic number. Along with protons inside the nucleus, we also have neutrons. And just like the name sounds, neutrons, they are neutral. So they do not have a positive, they do not have a negative charge. Those are shown here in red. So again, this nucleus right here in the center of your atom has your protons and your neutrons. We have one other type of subatomic particle known as your electrons. Your electrons are not found in the nucleus. The electrons actually kind of orbit around that nucleus. They are negative, and they orbit around in what we term these shells. So this blue line is a shell, this blue line is a shell, and that's where you find your electrons shown here in blue. Again, they have a negative electrical charge. Those atoms then can be joined through what we term covalent bonds. A covalent bond occurs when the atoms are actually going to share a pair of the electrons. To be stable, the atoms kind of try to fill those electron shells, also known as their orbits. So the first shell around that nucleus is going to want to have 2 electrons in it. So you can see that here, 1, 2, right? 1, 2. The second shell, so the second shell right here, it wants to have 8 electrons as well as every single shell after that, right? So it's only that first shell that's a little tricky. It only wants to have 2 electrons. Then every shell after that wants to have 8 electrons in its outer shell. And we're not going to go too in depth with this. Like if you took a chemistry class, you probably had to balance your electron shells, kind of figure out how many electrons would be in each shell. We're not going to get that complicated. This is a basic, biology and society class. We're not taking a chemistry course here. But I just wanted you to know that these atoms are going to covalently bond. Whenever you hear the term covalent bond, that means they're sharing their electrons. So you can see with an example here of NH3, so you have your nitrogen atom right here, and you have 3 hydrogen atoms. So you can see this first shell of the nitrogen is happy. It has 2 electrons. Then the second shell here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But we want 8, right? We want 8 for it to be happy and stable. So 8 minus 5 would give us 3, right? So we're going to have these 3 hydrogen atoms that have 1 electron each covalently bond here, so that now in that second shell we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 electrons, stable and happy. So a lot of times when you look at different bonds that have occurred covalently, it's in order to share the electrons so that you have the right number of electrons in each shell. And again, you're not going to be responsible for figuring out how to do that in this class. It's just something that I wanted you to kind of be reminded of. I'm sure you've heard it in a high school chemistry course before, but it may have been a while since that high school chemistry course, or maybe you didn't quite understand it, but that's what a covalent bond is. It's the sharing of electrons. One last thing that I wanted to mention in regards to matter organization is that there is a very key element when we talk about living organisms, and that element is carbon. So carbon, if we look at the structure of it, you can see carbon right here, right? So carbon has 4 electrons in its second shell. So you can see 2 in the first shell, and then it has 4 on the outer shell. So it's able to form 4 different covalent bonds. So you can see the covalent bonds here, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Just kind of to give you an example of how many covalent bonds it can form. 4 is the most covalent bonds that any element is able, or any atom is able to form with another. So carbon is so essential for life because it can make up to 4 covalent bonds, which again is the max. Carbon is the 4th most common element in the entire universe, and it is the 2nd most common element in the human body. So you can see here just 6 elements make up most of human weight. So oxygen is the most abundant at 65%, carbon is 18%, so the 2nd most abundant. And up here, it's just showing you again how these organic molecules, which we'll talk about what organic is in just a second, they have these chains of carbon atoms that are covalently bound to carbon and your hydrogen atoms here. You can see your oxygen atoms as well. So this is kind of a common structure of our organic molecules, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But I just wanted to bring up carbon and how it is able to form these 4 covalent bonds and how it is the 2nd most common element in the human body. So I told you we're going to talk a little more about organic molecules now that we're getting into looking at the molecules of life. So molecules are either characterized by being organic or inorganic. So for organic molecules, they have a carbon-based backbone, and they must have at least 1 carbon-hydrogen bond. So you can see here, you have your carbon backbone, meaning kind of that internal structure of that molecule, and then it must have at least 1 carbon-hydrogen bond. So I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we can keep counting, right? There are multiple in this particular molecule. This is glucose, or your simple sugar, right? So that is what an organic molecule is. I think sometimes people get a little bit confused and they assume it just has to have carbon to be organic. Really, if you look at the technical definition, it must have this carbon-hydrogen bond, at least 1 of those bonds. So different organic things are going to be the 4 molecules of life that we're about to talk about, which are your carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. But all organic molecules, again, must contain carbon. They're usually pretty large, and you're going to see, again, at least 1 carbon-hydrogen bond. In regards to inorganic molecules, they're going to lack, or they don't have, those carbon-based backbones, and they do not have a single carbon-hydrogen bond. So an example here would be oxygen gas, so just 2 oxygens, right? Water, again, 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Here we have carbon, right? So some people would automatically think it's organic. But again, if you look at the technical definition of organic, you must have that carbon-hydrogen bond, which you do not have with carbon dioxide. So inorganic molecules are going to be things like water, salts, many of your acids and bases. And again, they do not contain any carbon-hydrogen bonds. Before we actually look at the 4 different molecules of life, I wanted to kind of introduce a couple terms that you're going to hear when we talk about those 4 molecules of life. So your book talks about your macromolecules. Macro means large, so macromolecules are just large organic molecules. And they are composed of small subunits known as monomers. Mono means 1, so a monomer is just each one of these dots, right? Those are your monomers. And we'll talk about, in regards to the four macromolecules, different monomers of that. When we take and we put monomers together, we form what are known as polymers. So poly, if you break down that word, poly means many. So you're just taking many of these monomers and joining them together. You're bonding them together. So when we talk about our molecules of life, you'll probably hear me say, this is a monomer of this, or this is a polymer of this. So hopefully now you kind of understand monomer. Those are those single subunits. We take those single subunits, join them together to form our polymers. Okay, so I have told you we're going to talk about these four molecules of life. Here they are. There are four complex macromolecules that make up living things. Things that you've probably heard of before. Some of these you see just on the back of a nutrition label, right? So you have your carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So life is composed of organic compounds that contain atoms of carbon, hydrogen, and usually oxygen. And these are high energy molecules, meaning it takes a lot of energy to make them. And most of the organic molecules that occur in organisms are in these four main groups. And we're going to talk more about these four main groups in the following slides. We're going to begin by talking about carbohydrates, something you've probably all heard of before, probably referred to as carbs, right? Most of your carbohydrates are going to be used for energy, but some of them can also be used for storage or structural support. So carbohydrates are made of repeating subunits of simple sugars. And those simple sugars are monomers known as monosaccharides. So the most common example of a monosaccharide would be glucose. So it is a monosaccharide, again, meaning one sugar or simple sugar, and it's rarely found in food on its own. It's usually going to be in food as a polysaccharide or a disaccharide along with another sugar. So a disaccharide is going to be composed of two different types of sugars, so glucose and another type of simple sugar. Put that together and it's going to form a disaccharide. So you can also have a polysaccharide that has many different sugars together. And one good example of like a polysaccharide would be glycogen, right? That's how we store most of our sugars, is in the form of glycogen. So simple carbohydrates are made by green plants. They're broken down into glucose for energy. So examples of simple sugars would be things like soft drinks, sugar, milk, fruit. They have little nutritional value, right? Then we have our complex carbohydrates. These are also made by green plants. They're broken down into glucose for energy, but these are going to keep you fuller longer, and they're going to have a better source of energy for you. So that's going to be things like corn, peas, whole wheat bread, vegetables, oat bran. They take longer to break down and they usually contain fiber, which helps to keep our digestive system healthy. Kind of makes you feel fuller longer due to that fiber in the complex carbohydrates. The next molecule of life is our proteins, another one you've probably heard of. These are folded polymers made of repeating subunits of amino acids. So each one of those amino acids is a monomer. Put it together to form the polymer of your protein. Proteins are always going to have the same atoms in the main chain and different groups of atoms in the side chain. So you can kind of see that here. You put together these amino acids to form your protein. Proteins are the major structural component in the body, and one example of a protein would be an enzyme. They're a type of protein, and they actually control chemical reactions in our bodies. We get our protein from our diet. There are 22 amino acids that are part of human proteins in our body. 9 are essential, which means they're not produced by our body, so we have to get those amino acids from our diet. We ingest sources of these proteins, and then our body breaks down the peptide bonds. A peptide bond is what holds together each of those amino acids. So one amino acid, peptide bond, next amino acid, peptide bond, next amino acid. And then those amino acids are used to create other proteins in our bodies to have function in our bodies. So proteins are very necessary for us to be able to function well. The third molecule of life is our lipids, also known as fats. This is a very important energy storage molecule. They are not made of repeating monomers like we saw with our carbohydrates and our proteins. Lipids are hydrophobic. Hydro meaning water, phobic meaning fear. So they're water-fearing, they do not mix well with water. Something that you know if you've ever used salad dressing, right? Salad dressing has both water and oil in it, so usually those components separate, and that's why you always need to shake your salad dressing before you put it on your salad, right? So your body uses fats as a supply and a store of energy. A gram of fat actually contains more than double the amount of energy present in a gram of carbohydrate. The primary role of lipids in your body is to provide energy for muscles and body processes. So fat, like I said, it's very energy dense. So about half of the fuel your body needs when at rest or during everyday activity actually comes from lipids. When we look at the structure of lipids, they have what are termed fatty acids. So at least some of them do. These are kind of your different types of lipids that you see here. So right up here, these are your fatty acids. They consist of very long chains of these carbon atoms being linked together, right? And there are two main types of fatty acids that you've heard of before. You see on the back of your nutritional labels, either saturated fatty acids or unsaturated fatty acids. Saturated fatty acids, it shows you an example here, these are said to be saturated because all of the carbons are single covalent bonds. So they are saturated, they are full. So you can see that here, right? Whereas when we talk about unsaturated, you can see that there are some double bonds, right? And that kind of causes a little bit of a kink. So it's not a straight fatty acid tail. It gets kinks in the chain, so you can't smush it together as well. They are unsaturated fatty acids in that case. So all of your saturated fats are going to be solid at room temperature, whereas your unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. So think of like olive oil. That's an unsaturated fat versus butter, which is a saturated fat. You also have other types of fats like you can see here. You have your triglycerides, which are fatty acids plus a glycerol. You have cholesterol, which is a type of sterol, and you have phospholipids, which we'll talk much more about in chapter 3. The fourth and final molecule of life that I want to mention is your nucleic acids. These are polymers of repeating nucleotide subunits, and common examples of these would be DNA and RNA. These are both nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are going to carry information for building other biological molecules. DNA is the molecule of heredity. It provides the instructions for making proteins, and RNA also helps with making proteins. And we'll talk much more about nucleotides, the different types of bases, so A and T, C and G, as well as U or uracil for RNA. So we'll talk about the bases, RNA and DNA in a later chapter when we talk about DNA and protein making as well. One more thing kind of thrown in here, we talked about those 4 basic macromolecules, but I also just wanted to mention that cells are the basic structural unit of life. And we'll talk more about this in chapter 3 when we look at the cell theory, but your book kind of introduces it here in chapter 2, so I just wanted to make sure not to skip over that. Cells are, again, the basic structural unit of life, cannot exist without these cells. Cells are water-filled sacs that are bounded by a cell membrane. Cell membranes have a double layer, so bilayer, bi meaning two, and they separate the contents of the cell from its external environment. So I'm kind of glossing over this because we're going to talk a lot more about cells as well as cell membranes in Chapter 3. Okay, so on to our last learning objective, looking at water and the different properties of water and why it is so important to life. All of life's chemical reactions actually take place in water, and many living things can only survive a few days without water. So water is composed of oxygen and hydrogen atoms, as you can see here, and it is what we term a polar molecule. What it means by being a polar molecule is that the electrons are not equally shared between the atoms. This results, because you're not having an equal sharing of those electrons, you get a partial negative charge at one end of a water molecule, and the other end you see a partial positive charge. And so that's illustrated over here in this diagram. So the side where those hydrogens are ends up being more positively charged. The side where that oxygen is ends up being more negatively charged. So you have a negative side and you have a positive side. And many of the functions and properties of water are actually due to its shape. It kind of looks like Mickey Mouse ears here, right? So again, the electrons are not equally shared between the atoms in these covalent bonds. This causes this partial negative charge on one end, partial positive charge on the other. So in other words, water essentially has poles very similar to a magnet. Due to its structure, water forms special attractions known as hydrogen bonds with water as well as other molecules. Hydrogen bonds are what give water its very unique properties. So you can see here, you have the negative side with that oxygen, positive side with the hydrogens. So then you're going to see the positive hydrogen bond to the negative oxygen, right? So this is a hydrogen bond right here. You can also see that example here because opposites attract, right? So positive and negative attract, positive and negative attract to form these hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. So now you've joined 1, 2, 3 water molecules together using these two hydrogen bonds shown in blue. Over here you can see multiple of these hydrogen atoms all bonded together by these hydrogen bonds. So just to show you a little more in regards to the structure of hydrogen and the oxygen on that water molecules are unique in many ways. Again, each water molecule is going to have the slight positive charge, slight negative electrical charges. The positive charges are near, again, the hydrogen atoms. So you can see that here, right? Whereas the negative charge is around that oxygen atom. Due to these slight electrical charges, water molecules are going to be attracted to each other, right? The negative charge of one molecule is attracted to the positive charge of the other molecule. Opposites attract. So this allows for hydrogen bonding between the opposite partial charges. So negative to positive, positive to negative, positive to negative, positive to negative to form your hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. Now that you hopefully have a better understanding of the structure of water, we're going to look at the different properties of water that result due to the structure of water and kind of its unique hydrogen bonds. The first two properties we're going to talk about are both cohesion and adhesion. So cohesion, think co meaning together. This is where water molecules have a tendency to cling to one another. So because water is polar, the partial positive charge on that hydrogen atom will attract the partial negative charge on the oxygen atom and vice versa. And this allows the water molecules to stick together. This forms water columns that can flow up tree trunks against gravity, water surfaces that insects can actually land on and look like they're walking on water, raindrops and how those kind of stick together, etc. So cohesion is a tendency of water molecules to stick together. We also have adhesion, which is the tendency of water molecules to cling to other surfaces. So the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules allow for adhesion. So this allows water to pool on top of leaves. It allows it to pool on the spider webs, like you can see here. It also allows it to stick to animals' tongues, etc. So the first major property here of water is its tendency for cohesion. So the water molecules to stick together. That second property is for adhesion. So water tends to stick to other surfaces. Additionally, water has a very high, what we term heat capacity. And what I mean by heat capacity is that a lot of heat heat capacity is the amount of heat that is required to raise a substance's temperature by a given amount. And water is said to have a high heat capacity because a lot of heat is needed to raise the temperature of water. And I think the best example here, because we live on the island of Hawaii, is to think of when you go to the beach, right? And say it's around noon, you walk on the sand and it burns your feet, right? But when you go in the water, your feet they're not hot anymore, right? Because water is still pretty cool. That's because it takes so much more energy to change the temperature of the water compared to changing the temperature of the sand. So water has a very high heat of melting and heat of evaporation. So that means the heat required to either melt, so the heat required to melt an ice cube, and the heat required to evaporate a substance. So if you have water on the stove, in order to turn that into steam, that takes a lot of energy. So water has the highest heat of evaporation of any naturally occurring substance. So it has to absorb a great deal of heat before its temperature rises. The amount of heat required it has a very high heat of melting. It has the highest, actually, of any substance that occurs naturally. So that means that ice melts at a relatively high temperature and it absorbs a great deal of heat as it melts. So again, that's another very unique property of water. Another unique property of water is its density. So most substances are going to become more dense as their temperature decreases. This is a process known as thermal contraction. When water freezes, it actually forms crystals due to its hydrogen bonds. So when water forms the crystals, its volume actually increases by 9%. This means that additionally, if you think of like salt water, which we have all around us, the dissolved solids in it, being the sodium and chloride, making it salt water, that actually reduces the freezing point of water. So we need colder conditions to actually freeze seawater. Seawater never actually freezes except for at the poles. So water molecules are going to move closer to one another with lower temperatures. So in a gallon bucket of seawater at 75 degrees, the molecules are further apart than when the same gallon of water is at 35 degrees. When the molecules are closer together, that substance is said to have a higher density, which is exactly why ice floats. This is really important for organisms living in areas where there are freezing temperatures being common, such as the Arctic Ocean or around Antarctica. If ice didn't float, water would freeze from the bottom up, right? And this would be your result, right? You would see a lot of organisms frozen in that ice. That's why it's really important that ice actually floats on top of liquid water. So ice is less dense than liquid water due to all the air that is trapped in it. So again, this density of water is a very unique property of it. The next unique property of water is that it is actually the universal solvent. So a solvent is a substance in which another substance dissolves. And that substance being dissolved is termed the solute. So it's that substance that is dissolving inside of the solvent. A solution is the mixture that is formed by that solute and the solvent. So I know a lot of words that sound really similar. So I kind of put an example here that we're going to go through that hopefully helps you make sense of these three different vocab terms. So right here you see a beaker of water with sodium chloride or salt ions that are bound by the attractions between the opposite charges. In the water here, the weakly charged water molecules are attracted to the charges on the ions, and they're clustered around the ions. So you can see that here, your sodium is positively charged, your chloride is negatively charged, and then you can see these water molecules here are clustering around those sodium and chloride ions. This weakens the bonds between the ions, causing them to separate. Another term for that you'll hear chemistry-wise is dissociate. That means you're separating those ions. So this is your salt ion, your sodium chloride, that's salt, right? So you have the sodiums in yellow, chlorides in green here, and the water is going to cling to that and cause it to separate. So when a salt crystal is placed in water, and you can do this at home if you want, the strongly charged ions attract the water molecules with their weak charge, kind of like pieces of iron are attracted to a magnet, right? A layer of water molecules is going to surround each one of those ions, kind of insulating it from the other ions. This weakens that ionic bond that holds the salt crystal together, and then the ions pull apart and salt dissolves in your water. So in this case, your salt, your sodium chloride, is your solute. Your solvent is water. The solution that you end up with is salt water. So looking a little more at water as a universal solvent, because I know I introduced a lot of terms there. I talked about the ionic bond between sodium and chloride in the last slide, but didn't give you that actual definition of an ionic bond. An ionic bond is a very strong bond that is formed between oppositely charged ions. So water is going to dissolve polar molecules and other substances that contain these ionic bonds. An ion is simply a charged atom due to it either losing or gaining an electron. Again, something you probably talked in depth about in a high school chemistry course, but not something we're going to get super into. You probably had to figure out whether something was a cation, meaning positively charged, or an anion, negatively charged. We're not even going to deal with that in this course, but just wanting to let you know that water is the universal solvent. It's such a great solvent because it's able to dissolve these ionic bonds. It's able to surround those and break them apart. So that is why there are more substances that can be dissolved in water than in any other liquid on Earth. The last topic that we're going to cover in this lecture is talking about pH. So water molecules sometimes split into separate hydrogen that have this positive charge and hydroxide, so OH, negatively charged ions. pH then is a measure of the concentration, so in other words, how many hydrogen ions are in a solution. And pH ranges from 0 to 14. So in pure water, the number of hydrogen ions is exactly equal to the number of hydroxide ions. And that means that water is neutral. So it's right here, neutral pH. You have the same amount of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. If something is acidic or an acid, that means it has a higher concentration of hydrogen ions compared to hydroxyl ions, and it is going to be below 7 all the way down to 0. So it's going to have an acidic pH. So you can see if you look at each one of these examples, there are more hydrogen ions than there are hydroxyl ions. On the other hand, we have our bases. they're going to have a lower concentration of hydrogen ions compared to hydroxyl ions. And they're going to have a pH closer to 14. So you can see in each one of these examples, a lot of times it's kind of your cleaning supplies. They have much more hydroxyl ions than they have hydrogen ions. So the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution is what actually determines its pH. So again, just to kind of refresh that, the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution determines its pH. So acids have a higher concentration of hydrogen ions than hydroxyl ions. They have a pH closer to 0, whereas your bases have a lower concentration of hydrogen ions compared to hydroxyl ions. They have a pH closer to 14. So many of our biochemical reactions are only going to take place within a certain pH. So pH homeostasis is actually very important within our body cells. Strong acids and bases are highly reactive with other substances, which makes them potentially very destructive to the molecules inside a cell. So most organisms are going to function best when their pH stays within a certain range. So blood pH is usually around 7.4. It can range from about 7.35 to about 7.45 in humans. So blood is slightly basic. If your blood pH gets too acidic, it's known as acidosis, and that can actually be problematic. If it gets too acidic, it can actually be fatal. So again, pH is very important even within our bodies. So all the time we look at examples of pH kind of with this scale of all these different things that we use on a daily basis, whether it's drinking acidic coffee or drinking basic milk or using all these basic cleaning supplies. But pH is also important for our bodies as well. So that is all that I have for the Chapter 2 lecture. Just as a reminder, make sure you read Chapter 2 on Achieve and then also complete that Chapter 2 adaptive quiz. So as a reminder, with these adaptive quizzes, if you just simply do them all the way through and complete them, you get the full points. It is an all or none kind of thing, so just make sure you're completing that and you're going to get the full points for that on Achieve. That's all I have for today. Mahalo for watching.